Maple Hollow, winter 1893. The town lay still before the first cold snap of the season, but the elderly widow Eleanor Whitford, 67 years old, noticed the anomaly earlier than anyone else. She lived alone, accustomed to the harshness of the north, and carried in her memory the lessons Arthur, her Scandinavian-born husband, had taught her over many years before he passed. Arthur was a miner, a man who trusted facts more than luck. He had explained to her the principles passed down through generations in Scandinavia. The soil layer at depths of 6–10 feet always maintained a stable temperature of around 52–55 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how the air temperature changed. That was called subsurface thermal stability. Soil has thermal inertia. It absorbs heat slowly and loses heat slowly, creating a stable zone that windstorms cannot quickly alter. Cold attacks from above, Arthur said. Wind carries heat away faster than any insulating material, but below the ground, wind has no effect. He left Eleanor a notebook with drawings of a winter room based on the ancient Scandinavian Jordgeller technique. A room deep underground, ventilated according to pressure differential principles, with a load-bearing wooden roof and thick brick walls to prevent collapse. It was not an improvised shelter, but a calculated structure based on environmental physics. After he died in the blizzard of 1888, Eleanor kept the notebook but never thought she would have to build the structure herself. That is, until she began observing Maple Hollow over many years, roofs not reinforced to proper snow load standards, barns open to the wind, and everyone believing that experience was enough to get through winter. No one measured air pressure, no one calculated snow loads, no one cared about the laws of heat loss. They trusted habit more than theory. When the temperature dropped unusually fast in early November, Eleanor realized that year's cold cycle was unlike any before. She decided to use Arthur's drawings, not to challenge the town, but to survive. She began digging a pit behind the horse barn, a precisely calculated rectangular pit, 6 feet deep to reach the thermally stable zone, wide enough for brick walls capable of bearing compressive soil forces, ventilation pipes oriented to minimize wind pressure. She did not hide it, but she did not explain much either. And as she predicted, Maple Hollow's reaction came quickly. The townspeople called her crazy. They laughed at the sight of an old widow digging in the cold. They guessed she was looking for gold. Some said she was digging her own grave. They believed in frontier practicality, the oral tradition of experience that was ill-suited to facing a changing winter. The people of Maple Hollow were used to reinforcing roofs, stuffing extra straw into walls, burning more firewood. No one thought of using the earth as a natural thermal regulator. No one trusted Scandinavian immigrant techniques. The one who mocked her most was Gideon Hale, owner of the largest farm. He said outright in front of the crowd, "An old widow can't build anything useful by herself. Houses above ground are enough." He did not understand, nor did he want to understand, that houses above ground would be the first structures to fail in a blizzard. Amid the laughter, only one person stayed to carefully observe every move Eleanor made. Jonah Brooks, the 14-year-old boy who lived nearby. Jonah knew nothing about thermal inertia, nor did he understand why she measured wind direction before digging. But he recognized that every action she took had a clear purpose. When he asked, Eleanor simply said, "The ground holds warmth longer than the air. If you want to survive, you have to trust that." The statement was not philosophy. It was science. And in a town that trusted instinct more than facts, science was the easiest thing to ridicule, but it would decide who survived when winter truly began. Eleanor began digging the pit in the first week of November, when surface ground temperatures in Maple Hollow had dropped to 28–32 degrees Fahrenheit. Beneath that surface layer was a clay soil mixed with frost, with compressive strength of 1,500–2,000 pounds per square inches, hard enough to make a pickaxe rebound if not struck at the right angle. For a 67-year-old widow, it was not light work, but Eleanor always followed the principle her late husband Arthur had taught her. The earth is not dangerous if you understand its forces. She started by creating a rectangular cross-section, 6 feet x 8 feet, calculating the slope of the walls to prevent shear collapse, a common type of wall failure, if dug unevenly or in an uncontrolled arch shape. Her goal was to reach a depth of 6 feet, the zone Arthur had noted as where the soil begins to maintain a stable temperature of 52–55 degrees Fahrenheit due to subsurface thermal stability. As soon as she reached 3 feet, she encountered moist soil. Moist clay is a double-edged sword. At 20-25% moisture, it holds together well. But above 30%, it swells and exerts uneven pressure on brick walls later. Arthur had noted a simple test. Squeeze the soil in your palm. If it holds its shape without oozing, it's good. If it sticks to your hand, it needs drying. On the first day, Eleanor dried nearly 200 pounds of soil to reduce moisture to a safe level. The work proceeded in silence, accompanied only by the sound of the pickaxe and her steady breathing. Over 8 days, working about 4 hours each day, she gradually created a pit of exact depth. Passers-by did not understand. They only saw an old widow covered in cold dirt. They gossiped. Old widow Whitford digging a hole in November. Either a grave or she's lost her mind, Gideon Hale said outright. She's digging the hole that will bury her. But Eleanor paid no attention. She checked each wall with a wooden pole pressed against it to test elasticity, measured every angle with a plumb line, and recorded soil moisture in the notebook. She did not dig by feel like the people of Maple Hollow. She dug by principle. Once the pit was complete, she moved on to building the brick walls, the phase with the most potential for technical errors. The first time she mixed mortar, she used too much water, over 50%, making it runny and unable to hold the 6-pound bricks. The first row collapsed after 2 hours. The second time, she used too little water, making the mortar stiff and lacking adhesion, resulting in a brittle structure. The wall collapsed again. Eleanor paused. Reread Arthur's notes. The standard ratio was 1 part cement to 3 parts sand to about 0.45 parts water. The mortar should be stiff enough not to flow when the trowel is tilted at 45 degrees, but moist enough for deep bonding. On the third try, she mixed it correctly, then tested by pressing 2 bricks together for 30 seconds, separating them and seeing an even mortar layer on the surface, a sign of success. She built the walls to the thicknesses Arthur had specified, 8 inches on the south face, 10 inches on the north. This was not arbitrary. Winter winds from the north often create snowdrifts, increasing pressure on the wall by 20-40% compared to the south face. Wet snow load can reach 20-25 pounds per square foot, and if wind packs snow against the north face, pressure can approach 30-35 pounds per square foot. A 10-inch brick wall distributes force evenly and is twice as durable as the common 6-inch walls many homes used. Eleanor calculated each brick as if it were the difference between life and death. Jonah Brooks, the 14-year-old boy who lived 2 farms away, began coming more often. He could not help much with strength, but he asked questions, observed, and learned. Jonah noticed that Eleanor never placed 2 bricks without measuring the gap with a homemade ruler, never skipped checking vertical alignment with the plumb line. He asked, "Why do you measure every little thing? The adults in town don't do that." Eleanor replied, "If the angle is off by 3 degrees, the soil force will concentrate in the wrong place. If the force is misplaced, the wall bows. If the wall bows, it collapses." That answer made Jonah understand that the old widow was not working out of fear of winter. She was working because she understood structural forces. When the walls reached 4 feet, Eleanor began installing the ventilation system. Unlike common root cellars, she did not use straight vertical pipes. She made L-shaped pipes, 4 inches in diameter, with the intake 12 inches off the floor and the exhaust near the ceiling. She explained the stack effect principle to Jonah. Warm air is lighter and naturally rises through the upper pipe. Cold air enters slowly through the lower one. It exchanges air but does not draw heat out. If the pipes were straight, north winds at 20-40 miles per hour could easily create suction, pulling heat from the room in minutes. The L shape stabilizes airflow, prevents drafts, and provides enough oxygen without reducing temperature. The trapdoor was another technical challenge. Wood in Minnesota expands and contracts an average of 3-5 millimeters with moisture changes. If fitted too tightly, the door would jam when temperatures dropped suddenly. If too loose, cold wind would leak in, ruining thermal stability. Eleanor measured every millimeter with a wooden strip, planing it to account for the expected contraction when temperatures fell to 10-15 degrees Fahrenheit. Gideon saw her doing this and laughed loudly. Fighting winter with millimeters? She did not respond. But those millimeters would determine the room's survivability. The townspeople continued to treat her as a joke. They said, "Old Widow Whitford has lost her mind from fear of winter." But Eleanor knew that above-ground houses were the weakest in a blizzard. Wind could strip away 80% of heat in just hours. A small underground room stable at 52–55 degrees Fahrenheit, by contrast, could maintain life-saving warmth. By the end of November, the room frame was nearly complete. The walls stood firm, ventilation worked, the structure was stable. Only the ceiling and supplemental heating system remained. Jonah looked down into the pit and exclaimed, "It looks like a real structure." Eleanor replied, "It doesn't just look like one. It is one, and this winter will test whether it's right." She knew Maple Hollow was still mocking her, but she also knew that the mathematics of soil, the loads of wind, and the temperature of the earth did not care about anyone's laughter. On December 10, Eleanor completed the final part of the room, a double-layer wooden ceiling, installed exactly according to the dead-air space principle Arthur had drawn in his notebook. Two 1-inch thick boards were placed parallel, 2 inches apart, creating a layer of dead air between them, a still air pocket that reduces convective heat transfer. With this design, the ceiling could reduce heat loss by nearly 40% compared to a standard single-layer wooden ceiling. She tested load-bearing capacity by placing 3 wooden blocks, totaling 120 pounds on top, simulating future soil and snow compression. The ceiling did not bow or creak. Once the room was fully sealed, she descended the wooden steps and began a series of technical tests that almost no one in Maple Hollow had ever considered, let alone believed an old widow could perform. First, she checked ventilation for CO2 buildup. She lit a candle placed low, 12 inches off the floor, where CO2 accumulates most. If ventilation was poor, the flame would dim within minutes. But it burned steadily, proving the L-shaped pipes worked. Low cold air pushed in slowly. Warm air escaped gently through the upper pipe, without sudden suction from north winds. Next, she placed a basin of water at waist height, using condensation to observe heat loss rate. If the water surface fogged quickly, it meant high room humidity, a sign of heat loss or poor ventilation. But condensation was thin and stable, showing environmental balance. Finally, she measured temperature with the simplest yet most effective tool, a thin metal rod heated and inserted into the soil of the north wall. The stable soil heat altered the rod's cooling rate. Based on how quickly the glow faded over a set time, she estimated room temperature at around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly the level Arthur had recorded in Scandinavia during the worst winters. Outside, the temperature had dropped quickly to 18 degrees Fahrenheit and would fall further overnight. That difference was the first proof that the structure could save lives if the blizzard arrived as she predicted. Jonah was allowed to be the first person besides Eleanor to enter the room. The boy looked around at the even brick walls, the insulated double ceiling, the L-shaped ventilation pipes running along the corners as if it belonged to an era beyond Maple Hollows. Eleanor explained each part not as storytelling but as presenting facts. Why soil at 6 feet depth holds warmth, why CO2 pools low, why the ceiling needs dead air space to reduce heat loss, why ventilation pipes must not point straight up like the town's common cellars. Jonah listened with a focus he had never given the village schoolteacher. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. Eleanor answered, "From the only person in my life who knew how not to die in winter." The statement carried no drama, only truth. After successful testing, Eleanor began stocking supplies according to the 3-layer survival model Arthur had written down. Layer 1, quick consumption foods, jerky, compressed flour cakes, root vegetables. Layer 2, medium-term foods, pickled jars, dried beans, high-protein hardtack. Layer 3, emergency reserves, honey, salted meat, and clean water stored in insulated wooden barrels. She also stocked a small but steady supply of firewood for the heater, to be used only if underground temperature dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, rare except in unusually prolonged blizzards. But as the structure neared completion, the wind began to shift. In this region, winter winds usually blew from the northwest. But on December 14, it suddenly reversed 180 degrees to the southeast. That was the sign of a deep low-pressure system, something locals did not recognize. But Eleanor knew from Arthur's stories of Scandinavia, when the wind shifts like that, air is being pulled down. The blizzard will come fast and fierce. She performed a simple pressure measurement. A glass jar with a taut rawhide cover tied over the mouth, then observed the cover's concavity. In the morning, it was nearly flat. By afternoon, it had sunken nearly 2 millimeters, enough to signal a sharp pressure drop. No meteorology knowledge needed, just the understanding that falling pressure plus wind reversal equals major storm. Birds also vanished on December 15, not flying away, but disappearing entirely from the trees, a natural reaction when animals sense low-pressure waves. Eleanor counted every sign: wind, pressure, animals, morning temperature dropping faster than usual. She did not wait long. Late on December 15, she walked through Maple Hollow, knocking on every door. She did not speak of a vague snowstorm. She spoke in facts: wind reversal, sudden pressure drop, soil temperature fluctuations, and the birds' disappearance. But instead of listening, they smirked. Superstitious old widow rumors. She reads nonsense from those northern Europeans. Minnesota is used to storms. No one needs an underground hole. Gideon Hale said the harshest words. If you're right, then we've been wrong all these years? No way. The town rejected the warning. Eleanor said only one thing before turning back. I don't need anyone to believe me. I just want Maple Hollow to survive. That night, an unusual stillness enveloped the land, the kind of silence that appears when nature takes a deep breath before striking. And Eleanor knew. The blizzard would come sooner than they thought. The blizzard hit Maple Hollow on the morning of December 17, and it did not arrive the way people here were used to. No gradual buildup of wind, no thick clouds as warning. One moment the sky was dull gray, the next it was complete whiteout visibility under 3 feet, all outlines gone. Wind surged to 55-65 miles per hour in minutes, enough to rip off old wooden roofs without wind braces. That wind speed also created lateral loads exceeding 15-20 pounds per square foot on north cabin walls, beyond the capacity of weathered wood. While the town scrambled to board up and nail extra planks, Eleanor had already descended into the shelter when the wind changed tone. She was not panicked. She understood the physics of this environment better than anyone. The underground shelter faced no direct wind because wind force transmitted through the surface soil is dispersed by natural earth load distribution. Wind could tear off roofs and topple walls, but it could not create large oscillations in compacted soil. Wooden cabins were different. At 60 miles per hour's crosswind, the structure immediately vibrated with small but continuous amplitude. Gradually loosening joints, Eleanor stood in the shelter and heard the cabin above shaking like it was gasping, signaling imminent loss of stability. The wind shifted repeatedly in the first 20 minutes, creating reverse vortices on the hillside that packed snow onto cabin roofs. When snow depth exceeded 14 inches and turned to wet snow, roof load reached nearly 22-25 pounds per square foot. Eleanor's cabin, built when Arthur was alive, was not designed for such vertical compressive loads. A loud crack echoed into the shelter. The west roof collapsed, pulling down the ridge beam, not because of tragedy, but simply because wood handles compression poorly compared to lateral forces and lacked reinforcement used in far north regions. Minutes later, a second crack appeared in the north wall. Wind hammered the wall like a steady hammer, each blow governed by low-level wind dynamics against vertical surfaces. While the above-ground world collapsed piece by piece, Eleanor and her dog Bruno remained remarkably stable below. Temperature held at 53-54 degrees Fahrenheit, fluctuating less than 1 degree Fahrenheit thanks to the thermal inertia of surrounding soil, retaining heat slowly, unaffected by extreme external swings. Eleanor walked slowly around the room, checking brick walls by placing her hand near the ventilation pipe to feel vibration. No significant vibration proving wind force did not transmit down here, as calculated. Bruno, sensitive to oscillations, did not tremble or panic. He lay close to her feet, ears twitching only at loud sounds from the collapsing cabin. The contrast between surface chaos and underground stability made the room almost too quiet a silence, not of peace, but of nature testing human limits. Eleanor did not say it aloud, but she knew. When a blizzard follows a sudden pressure reversal pattern, it could last 3-5 days longer than any in Maple Hollow's memory. She sat down, recording observations in Arthur's notebook. Estimated wind speed, cabin vibration cycles, snow compression based on impact sounds. Anyone seeing it would think she was doing an engineer's work. not that of an old widow the town considered eccentric. Around midday, when wind peaked and sounds from the cabin above had nearly ceased because most of the structure had fallen, Eleanor heard a different sound, light, intermittent, uneven, not wind, not cracking wood. A weak tap on the trapdoor. Once, then pause. Then again, slightly stronger but still feeble. To the unfamiliar, it might seem like snow hitting wood. But Eleanor recognized it immediately. The knocking pattern of someone in hypothermia stage 1-2, when muscles weaken and arms lack strength for steady knocks. At this wind level, no one could survive outside longer than 10-15 minutes. The person was on the edge of danger. Bruno pricked his ears. Eleanor moved under the trapdoor and placed her hand on the wood. Another knock, weaker than the previous two. She understood instantly the blizzard had only begun, and Maple Hollow had yet to grasp the horror awaiting above ground. The storm would not kill them with wind, but because they refused to believe what was happening beneath their feet. And Eleanor knew these first knocks were only the beginning of the town's fate. Jonah appeared at the trapdoor when the wind was howling loudest, his body nearly collapsing before he could knock again. When Eleanor lifted the door, cold wind rushed in like an invisible blade, and Jonah managed only a very faint sound. His skin was pale, lips purple, eyes unfocused, classic hypothermia stage 2. When the body becomes disordered, speech slurs, and balance fails. He fell almost entirely into Eleanor's arms. She immediately pulled him down and closed the door in seconds to prevent heat loss. Bruno barked softly and moved aside. Eleanor did not ask questions yet. She checked breathing, tested joint stiffness, then wrapped him in wool blankets. Only when warmth began returning to Jonah's skin did she hear him manage a few broken sentences. Their house had collapsed. The wooden roof could not handle continuous wet snow buildup plus diagonal southeast wind shear. Jonah spoke haltingly, but enough for Eleanor to understand the failure mechanism. Wet snow plus wind shear caused the entire structure to break along the ridge beam. When the roof compressed downward, walls lost connection, and in minutes the cabin became rubble. His father and mother ran after him but grew weaker with every step. At wind chill around -55 degrees Fahrenheit, adults had only 10-12 minutes before losing mobility. Eleanor knew time was short. She lit the heater at low, only 1/3 normal firewood, then explained briefly to Jonah, partly to keep him alert. Burn too much, and it uses all the oxygen. When CO2 builds up, we don't notice until it's too late. This was not book knowledge. It was survival wisdom any long-lived frontier person knew by heart. She checked the ventilation pipes, adjusted the windshield to prevent backdraft, ensuring proper stack effect airflow. Minutes later, wind noise was interrupted by different sounds, shuffling steps, weak breathing, then slow, heavy knocking, as if the person could barely lift an arm. Eleanor lit a candle near the door, opened it just enough to pull 3 people in. Jonah's parents and little sister, all 3 in critical condition. Skin chalk white, breathing shallow, clothes soaked. Eleanor acted without hesitation. She handed out dry clothes prepared in advance, thick blankets, then gave them sips of warm, not hot water, because rapid reheating can cause heart shock or arrhythmia. She placed them near the heater but not touching it, checked fingers for sensation. All these actions were practical experience, the way 19th century northern people treated frostbite without medical equipment. Jonah gradually recovered and observed the space around him, thick 8-10-inch brick walls holding stable heat, double-layer wooden ceiling creating dead air space, precisely placed L-shaped ventilation pipes, preventing drafts, everything arranged by logic. Nothing random, not a crazy hole, as rumored, not the act of a widow fearing winter. This was an engineered survival system, a structure calculated with physics, experience, and preparation that the entire town had refused to believe in. Jonah's gaze changed. For the first time, he understood Eleanor was not trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what science and her ancestors' history said would save lives. And he realized the place the town had mocked was becoming the only thing still standing in a storm they were utterly unprepared for. 2 hours after Jonah's family entered, the blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Instead of fading like normal storms, the wind grew stronger, creating sastrugi hard, wavy snow ridges 1-2 feet high, enough to deflect wheels or overturn horse carts in gusts. And true to this danger, two farmers from the eastern ranch lost control, their cart hitting a sastrugi ridge and tipping over. The two men crawled through deep snow to Eleanor's ruined cabin, then knocked on the trapdoor with swollen, frozen knuckles. It was not panic knocking, but the sound of people who had nearly spent their last strength. Eleanor did not hesitate. She opened the trapdoor once more. Each time, precious heat escaped in the downward gust, but thanks to the thick 8–10-inch brick walls conducting heat slowly and the 6 feet depth, temperature recovered quickly after closing. She pulled the two men down and shut the door in under 5 seconds, the timing she had instinctively practiced. Cold air flooded in briefly, but her homemade thermometer dropped only to about 51 degrees Fahrenheit before climbing back to 53–54 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. With the two new arrivals, 8 people now occupied the shelter. The underground room was designed for 1–2 people, not a group in a prolonged blizzard. Oxygen consumption rose significantly. Though the L-shaped ventilation worked on stack effect, principal warm air rising, cold air entering slowly from the low pipe, Eleanor still checked pipes every few hours for ice or snow blockage. She explained briefly to everyone. The upper pipe exhausts, the lower draws in. The small pressure difference keeps air moving. If one pipe clogs, we'll suffer CO2 poisoning before realizing it. No one argued. They looked at her in silence, mixed with fear and respect, the emotion that arises when people realize what they mocked is saving their lives. Space grew tighter. Adults sat close together, children placed near the heater but not touching. Eleanor organized areas. East corner for those recovering, west for the stronger. Everything was managed, as if she had run a shelter her whole life. Occasionally someone whispered, "Widow Whitford saved us." Not because she performed a miracle, but because she prepared based on principles they had never wanted to understand. That quiet, broken but genuine statement was the first sign that Maple Hollow's beliefs were cracking, collapsing, and reforming in an entirely new direction. Above, the blizzard continued destroying the world they thought solid. Below, an old widow they had ridiculed was keeping them alive with the precision of science and ancestral experience. Gideon Hale appeared near midnight, when the winter room was already full, and the air had begun to feel thick in the way only those who have lived underground recognize. His knocking was different from the others, weak but steady, as if he was using his last strength to stay upright until rescued. When Eleanor cracked the door, wind whipped in, making the nearby candle flicker wildly. Gideon nearly collapsed down the steps. The little granddaughter he carried already blew, all over clear signs of hypothermia. Stage 3. Loss of shivering. Slow pupil response. Shallow and irregular breathing. This was the moment akin to the second plea for salvation in the original. The man who had mocked her most, the proudest in town, now on the brink of death. Eleanor said nothing, asked nothing. She simply pulled them down and closed the door with one quick, precise motion. Bruno stood close to her legs, growling softly at the wind. Not the people. In the shelter, all eyes turned to Gideon, not because he mattered most, but because he embodied years of the town's denial. But no one spoke. Every ounce of strength was devoted to holding warmth, breath, and life. When the number of people rose to 10, the shelter entered a state of technical overload. It was not a community bunker. It was designed for 1–2 people, at most 3. Now oxygen consumption was 4 times higher than normal. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. The test candle in the corner of the room burned down to only 3/4 of its original brightness, a sign that oxygen levels were starting to drop. The walls could not be expanded. The air could not be increased. She could only adjust the parameters within her control. She reduced the firewood to the minimum, keeping the fire just enough to maintain a temperature around 52–54 degrees Fahrenheit. Burning more wood would cause the heater to consume too much oxygen and release CO2 faster than the ventilation pipes could handle. Then she widened the exhaust pipe by exactly 1/4 inch, no more, no less. If she opened it too much, cold wind could create strong suction, pulling heat out of the shelter. If she opened it too little, the air would not renew enough for 10 people to breathe through the night. This was a decision under stress, the kind of moment the original story includes, but does not analyze in depth. An error of a few millimeters could put the entire shelter in danger. She did these things in silence, but that very silence made the simmering psychological conflict even clearer. Gideon, the man who had once said Eleanor was digging her own grave, now sat leaning against the brick wall she had built, unable to say a word because he knew anything he said would be meaningless in this situation. A woman in the group whispered to the person next to her, "If she knew beforehand, why didn't she tell us?" The question was not directed at Eleanor, but at the town's own fear and habits, the things that had made them unwilling to listen to the truth when she spoke it. Jonah heard it but did not react, because he had witnessed it from the beginning. The adults in Maple Hollow never believed anything that went beyond ordinary experience, even when it was clear fact. When everyone had settled, Eleanor finally spoke, without reproach, without complaint, just one very short sentence. "I did tell you. But not everyone is ready to hear things that make them feel wrong." The words brought complete silence to the room, not because they felt offended, but because they understood it was a truth laid bare at the moment they least wanted to face it. They had not been ready to listen, because listening meant having to change, and change meant letting go of faith in old experience, the thing they had always taken pride in. The night stretched on as if it had no end. The wind outside decreased in amplitude but showed no sign of easing. It was a sign that snow was piling into large dunes, where the wind could no longer push the powder away but only accumulate it in thick layers. These dunes could reach 6-10 feet high, completely ruining any attempt to dig escape routes when the storm ended. The people in the room did not understand this phenomenon, but Eleanor did. This was the most dangerous time, not because of the wind, but because the snow was restructuring the surface, changing loads, capable of collapsing any cabins still standing on the ground. In the darkness of the small room, lit only by 2 oil lamps and a small heater, each person gradually realized the truth they had once rejected. They were alive thanks to a structure they had mocked, and as they looked up at the double-layer wooden ceiling, at the thick brick walls, they began to understand that an old widow, working alone, was not crazy. She was simply the only person in Maple Hollow who knew how to heed the Earth's warnings. Gideon sat leaning against the brick wall, his breathing steadier, but his eyes holding something not cold but ashamed. It took him a long time before he spoke, his voice hoarse and halting as if pulling layers of ice from his throat. "Eleanor, I'm sorry." The entire room paused. No one laughed, no one mocked. Everyone knew this moment was more than a simple apology. But Eleanor did not respond with emotion. She did not comfort, did not blame, did not nod. She just looked at Gideon and said in a calm voice, as if reading a formula, "I didn't build the shelter to prove I was right. I built it because the wind will do what wood cannot withstand. The wind doesn't care who is right or wrong. It just does what it has to do." The room fell silent again, but not the tense silence as before. It was the kind of silence when a truth has just been placed among everyone. Gideon bowed his head, his hands clenched tightly. "I didn't believe you," he said, "not because you were wrong, but because your knowledge wasn't like what we call frontier common sense. We were used to bracing roofs, stuffing extra straw, using what our fathers did. While you talked about 6 feet depth, about soil temperature, about wind pressure, I didn't understand those things, so I laughed, because people always laugh at what they don't understand." Eleanor listened but did not interrupt. She had been familiar with this kind of defense all her life, the small-town culture where strange knowledge was seen as more dangerous than a storm. A farmer who had entered the shelter just hours earlier spoke up. "I was the same. I thought you were old, living alone, so delusional. I thought physics was for educated people, not farmers like us. But it turns out..." He reached out and touched the brick wall, where the Earth's warmth still lingered. "Physics is what saved us." A young mother holding her shivering child continued. "I once thought digging deep into the ground was crazy, but now I understand we were the crazy ones, thinking those cracked wooden roofs would protect us." The confessions were no longer personal regret. They became a collective transformation, the kind the original story touches on but never analyzes deeply. In the darkness of the winter room, the people of Maple Hollow for the first time relied not on experience, but on reason to analyze what had just happened. Jonah watched it all, and understood more deeply than any adult. He looked at Eleanor not as an eccentric old widow, but as the only person in town who understood the relationship between earth, wind, and heat. The only one who knew that nature should not be challenged with belief, but with measurable knowledge. For Jonah, This was no longer a shelter. It was the only classroom still operating in the middle of the storm. He listened to every word Eleanor said as she instructed how to place firewood so it would not consume too much oxygen, how to check the breathing of someone with hypothermia, how to use water vapor to measure room humidity. His eyes lit up little by little, as if he had finally seen the bridge between numbers and life. The rest in the shelter began joining the exchange. One person asked, "How did you know a 10-inch brick wall could withstand soil pressure?" Another asked, "Why does 6 feet depth hold warmth?" An older person wondered, "What did you see to know the storm would strike from the southeast that day?" Eleanor did not give long lectures. She answered each clearly. 6 feet depth is where the soil maintains stable temperature, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. A 10-inch wall distributes soil force better when snow drifts pile up. Rapid wind reversal is a sign of a deep, low-pressure system. A deep low pulls air down, pulling the storm in. Each of Eleanor's words was like pulling cold metal from their minds, replacing it with clarity. And so, those who had once mocked her were now learning. They no longer saw her knowledge as odd. They saw it as the only thing standing between them and the death outside. A change spread through the air, not a change in temperature, but in perception. Right there in the small room, 6 feet underground, with wind howling above and death lurking on the surface, Maple Hollow began to understand that their survival did not come from strength, but from knowledge they had once rejected. And in that same moment, they realized an old widow had saved them with the very thing they lacked most understanding. The blizzard ended on the morning of the 5th day, not gradually fading but stopping abruptly, as if someone had flipped a giant switch in the sky. Eleanor checked the wind direction and knew the reason immediately. The Arctic air mass had withdrawn. As the low-pressure area weakened, cold wind was no longer pulled downward, creating an atmospheric void that made the storm stop as quickly as it had arrived. She explained it to everyone in the shelter. The storm didn't disappear. It just moved away from us, heading to the next low-pressure area. When everyone climbed out of the shelter, Maple Hollow had become an unfamiliar landscape. Snow had drifted into dunes 8–10 feet high on the north sides, burying half the cabins. Homes with low-pitched roofs under 30 degrees had collapsed completely because they could not bear the wet snow load. Livestock barns built from soft wood had split along the grain, falling like cardboard boxes. The damage was greater than anyone had imagined. Among the dead, most had not died from being buried, but from wind chill driving the body into hypothermia in just minutes, a type of death that leaves no external marks but is crueler than compacted snow. As the survivors gathered in the small town square, the emotions bottled up over 4 days in darkness began to surface. A few people were angry, either from grief or from needing someone to blame. A woman said, "If she knew winter would be this bad, why didn't she tell us?" Another man added, "She kept it secret. If we had known, maybe more people could have been saved." No one spoke loudly, but an undercurrent of blame had emerged. Eleanor stood there, not defending herself. She had faced the town's skepticism all her life. She understood that emotions after disaster are often irrational. But before anyone could say anything harsher, Gideon Hale stepped forward. Wind whipped his face, but he stood straight, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "None of us has the right to blame this woman." Every eye turned to him, the man who had once been loudest in mocking Eleanor. He continued, this time using the very technical language Eleanor had used. She warned us. She talked about the 180 degrees wind shift, about falling pressure, about the 6 feet soil layer holding heat. But we didn't listen because we thought frontier common sense was enough to understand winter. We thought our experience was right over her facts. That's not her fault. That's ours. No one interrupted. Those who had blamed her lowered their heads. Those who had laughed at her fell silent. And those who had once seen her as eccentric now realized that without the shelter, they would not be standing here to say anything at all. Gideon ended with a sentence that left the entire square speechless. "We survived because she used science we refused to learn. No one has the right to accuse the only person who prepared correctly." His words erased the remaining traces of blame. No one continued to fault Eleanor. The town closed the conflict with a bitter but necessary acknowledgement. What they thought they knew had nearly killed them, while what they had mocked had saved them. And that truth would stay with Maple Hollow for generations to come. When the snow began to melt in early spring, Maple Hollow entered the rebuilding phase. But that year, rebuilding was not just about putting up houses again. It became a process of relearning how to understand winter. Eleanor, once called the widow digging her grave, was now invited by the town itself to guide the construction of winter rooms using the technique she had proven with their very survival. She did not teach vaguely. She taught with clear, verifiable principles. She showed them the safe depth, 6 feet to reach the thermally stable zone, where soil always maintains around 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how brutal the blizzard. She instructed on proper brick wall thickness, 8 inches on the south face, 10 inches on the north to distribute snow and wind pressure, preventing collapse when drifts accumulated. On ventilation, she explained that simply making holes was not enough. A pressure difference must be created between the low intake pipe and the high exhaust pipe to maintain the stack effect, allowing oxygen in and CO2 out without losing heat. She demonstrated by lighting a candle to show airflow, and when someone asked how to prevent damp soil from causing mold or heat loss, she showed them the isolation layer of dry sand and thin wood lining that stabilizes ground moisture, something many had never considered. That spring, 14 families began building new winter rooms. Eleanor went to each site, checking every row of bricks, every ceiling corner, every ventilation pipe. When someone made a mistake, she did not scold. She simply said, "An inch wrong today can become a foot of danger in winter." She reminded them to waterproof, to measure moisture with simple methods, not to use wood prone to warping with humidity. Each completed room was proof that knowledge not only saves lives, but can be passed on. When one family asked what they should call these rooms, a child answered, "Whitford Rooms." The name spread in just weeks, not to honor Eleanor as a hero, but to remind that she had changed how Maple Hollow viewed winter. News spread beyond the town faster than she expected. Farmers from neighboring counties came to see for themselves. Local newspapers wrote about the old widow who built a shelter that saved an entire town from the worst blizzard in 30 years. Migrants stopped in Maple Hollow and carried the technique farther to Winter Ridge, Pine Creek, even to northern Minnesota, where winters were longer and harsher. In just one season, Eleanor's winter room technique had crossed the borders of a small town. It became practical knowledge, easy to build, easy to understand, and most importantly, proven effective with real lives. And though she sought no fame, everyone knew that Maple Hollow had entered a new era, not by luck, but thanks to an old widow who dared to believe what they had rejected. The earth remembers warmth, and knowledge saves people. Eleanor Whitford died in the spring of 1905, at the age of 79. News of her passing spread through Maple Hollow in just hours, and people came in such numbers that the road to the cemetery had to be cleared of snow for them to stand. No one called her Old Widow anymore, as they had in the early years. In their eyes, she was the person who had changed the town's fate. The families who had sheltered in her winter room that year stood close together, saying little, but each carrying deep gratitude because without the room they had once mocked, they might not be here to bid her farewell. Jonah Brooks, now a man in his 30s, was asked to read the eulogy. He stood before her grave, his voice low and steady. "She was not afraid of storms," he said. "She only respected physics. We survived not by luck, but because she understood what we refuse to understand, that nature is not to be confronted, but to be read, listened to, worked with." No one expected Jonah to speak such words, but everyone knew they were true. He was the child who had seen the first room when no one yet believed her. He was the one who witnessed the town's transformation from rejection, mockery, fear, to gratitude. Many years after Eleanor's death, her winter room remained intact. Though the cabin above had to be replaced twice, once due to fire, once because the floorboards rotted, the underground shelter needed no major repairs. The 10-inch brick walls, double-layer ceiling, L-shaped ventilation pipes, everything retained its shape. A group of engineers from Minneapolis visited in the 1,940 seconds and measured the room's temperature at different times of year. The results surprised no one. 54 degrees Fahrenheit, varying less than 1 degree Fahrenheit from the figures when Eleanor built it half a century earlier. One in the group said, "This is a better lesson in environmental heat than any university." Over time, Her winter room technique not only spread across Minnesota but was recorded in many documents of Northern Farmers Associations. No one called it an invention, and Eleanor surely would not have wanted that because she knew Scandinavian ancestors had developed these principles centuries before. But she was the one who brought it to Maple Hollow, the one who proved that understanding natural laws correctly matters more than any blind struggle. Thanks to her, Northern Americans began to change how they viewed winter, no longer as an enemy to confront, but as a force to understand, calculate, and work with. Jonah, in a storytelling session at the village school years later, told the students, "Mrs. Whitford did not defeat the storm. She only knew how to listen to the earth, to the wind, to the laws we had forgotten. And because of that, we are still here." Those words made many adults bow their heads. They remembered the time they laughed at her, criticized her, then begged her when the storm came. And they understood that her legacy was not the bricks or the wooden ceiling, but a new way of thinking, using science as the foundation for survival, humility before nature as the compass. Eleanor's gravestone stands beside the old pine where she liked to sit each afternoon. On it is engraved a simple line that says everything about her life. She listened to the earth and saved a town that refused to listen. It was not excessive praise. It was the historical truth of Maple Hollow. An old widow, mocked for unusual knowledge, had saved an entire town with wisdom they had once deemed useless. And every winter that returned, when the wind shifted again and snow began piling into white dunes on the hills, the people of Maple Hollow remembered her, the one who taught them that the earth remembers warmth and those who know how to listen will survive.